Happy Independence Day, belatedly, and welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast edition. Joining me as always on Tuesdays, the Prince of Twitter, the Regent of RedState.com, who's also, by the way, ironically, a big fan of liberty and freedom, Andrew Malcolm. You know, for a prince and a regent, you do democracy pretty well, man.
Yeah, I do. Well, regal is a burden that I carry, but it's a responsibility to my country.
All right, well, there you go. From the regent and the prince right there, as an endorsement of democracy. You don't find that in the British monarchy. I'm telling you that right now, folks.
No, but there was a great cartoon on Twitter on Sunday, saying with George Washington on his horse pointing a saber at the viewer and saying, "Have a great day at work tomorrow, Britain."
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed work on Monday, folks. If you weren't in the United States, we had a holiday. I don't know about the rest of you guys. All right. And that's a great way to sort of lead into your VIP column over at redstate.com. The strange mix of modern U.S. politics and holidays. Now, we've just been through a couple of them. We had Juneteenth, which was a big Texas holiday here for decades before it became a federal holiday. And I don't think anybody was really all that interested in Arbor Day. Nobody took the day off. I went out and hugged a tree. No, I really didn't.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about the strange mix of modern U.S. politics and holidays.
Well, it's part of it is personal. It's reminiscence. I start off with taking my oldest son, who was a toddler at the time, to his first fireworks show in Fort Lee, New Jersey. We're sitting on the blanket, waiting that interminable wait as darkness grows for the start of the fireworks, families all around. And now he knew nothing about fireworks, but he knew to be excited because I was excited.
Right.
And I told him it was a birthday party outdoors in the dark. So he was really intrigued by that. So we're sitting there, and then, at the start of the show, they shoot off one of those huge mortar rounds. It doesn't do anything except soar into the sky and explode with a huge thunk that ruffles your shirt. And that went off, and his eyes grew very wide. And then he jumped up, grabbed his teddy bear, and said, "Okay, let's go." That was the show. That's the show. That's a wrap.
We're done.
But yeah, well, we didn't leave, and I tutored him on the fine points of watching fireworks and when to go ooh and ah and so forth. So we've enjoyed many displays since. But what I did was I went through and looked at the holiday and the state of politics today in the country, and I won't spoil it for people, but in case somebody might go there. But trying to tie in a holiday and the state of our country and politics, and I hope it worked.
Well, I hope it does too, but I mean, it's a good time for this column because, the city of Orlando, this was, I think, just a day or so before your column went live up at redstate.com. City of Orlando issued this really weird statement or declaration. I think it was on the 3rd, right? It may have been on Sunday or could have maybe even been on Saturday, saying, well, we know that a lot of people don't feel like celebrating our nation's, birthday because blah, 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 blah. People looked at that and said, well, screw you too, pal. I mean, I'm sorry that maybe things aren't going your way at the moment, but that's no reason to sit there and say, well, I'm not going to celebrate being an American because the policies I like are not in place. I mean, that's a theme. There were a lot of celebrities. Was it Jessica Chastain? Yes.
Was making an obscene gesture on Twitter towards the holiday for the country. I guess the abortion ruling and the gun ruling combined, and just the general state of their leader, their party's leader and the country's leader, unfortunately, has caused them to want to make a sour statement about the nation's birthday. So,
we're talking on Independence Day, by the way. We're actually recording this on Independence Day. And this is the thing that really frustrates me about people. And I'm going to break into my Andy Rooney here. Andrew, I'm going to uncork my Andy Rooney. What is it about people who are just not happy about this country unless all their policies are adopted? I don't understand that. You didn't hear this from conservatives for 50 years after Roe v. Wade. They never said, oh, we're embarrassed for our country. Oh, we hate our country. They just worked to try to change things. How was that?
Andy. Right, Andy.
There's two Andys. We got two Andys.
Yeah,
all of a sudden there's two Andys.
Exactly right. Yeah. That was a good one, by the way.
Thank you. I've been working on that one for a while. The older I get, the better I am at that, by the way.
He'll be here all week, folks.
It's really maybe the only impression I do passably well. And I used to really like Andy Rooney just because he had that whole curmudgeon thing going on. But I mean, honestly, this is my gripe, right? Yeah. When you're talking about people who are unhappy about the Dobbs ruling, which overturned Roe, well, I'm sorry, but conservatives have been fighting Roe v. Wade for 50 years, and you didn't hear conservatives say, I don't want to live in my country. I think my country's an embarrassment. Even though this country, our abortion policies were roughly similar to that of China and North Korea's, you didn't hear people go on the 4th of July saying, well, we had another, 900,000 abortions in this country, so I just can't celebrate this. I mean, I never saw anybody say that.
You didn't, and that's typical of the different attitudes of both sides. And that was part of the column on Sunday, that examining why is it so partisan now, and the forces behind that drove this increased partisanship in the country, and it was for you're right, for 50 years. It's I also did an audio commentary on this, that when the Supreme Court makes a decision like Roe v. Wade, it was way ahead of its time. And so we've had 50 years of division and anger and even some deaths growing out of it. And yet 2017, the Supreme Court makes its decision on gay marriage, and things didn't explode because the Supreme Court made its decision when the country was ready for it. The polls showed that most people were, they might not like it, but okay, if two people who love each other want to be together, whatever. And so there wasn't the kind of divisiveness and split. Now, it didn't have to do with life and death, but it did show that when the court makes a decision in the time for it, that it's generally accepted.
Right. Well, and the thing is that, and this is really more to the point. All Dobbs did was return the issue back to state legislatures and potentially to Congress too. I mean, there's an argument that Congress can still legislate on this as well, but they're literally handing this back to the democratic process rather than 50 years of the judiciary basically usurping the legislative role when it comes to abortion policy. And so they didn't rule that abortion is illegal. They didn't rule that abortion is legal. They said the Constitution doesn't have anything to say about this. And so really neither should we. So we're going to vacate Roe. We're going to vacate casing, give it back to the legislatures so the people can come up with the right policy. And I mean, that is actually democracy. And so you hear people saying, democracy's dying. No, it's not. The Supreme Court just expanded democracy in public policy. No matter what you think about it, that's what the effect of this was. Exactly right. So instead of one big national fight, they've got to fight 50 or less because some states have already decided. But that's
you're right. It's the way it works. The state government is much closer to people than Washington. Washington is like on another planet, I think, the way most people look at it. And that was a feeling that Trump played on so effectively in 2016. Washington was so isolated and so disconnected, and both parties were, he said. And and it worked for him electorally.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the point of your column is spot on, because I've been frustrated the last few days watching all these people say that, 4th of July is meaningless now because the Supreme Court, pissed on their Wheaties or whatever you want to say, however you want to put it, right? I mean, it's just...
That's a great line. Well, we used to have election seasons and parties... Excuse me, parties trotted out their issues that made us into two camps, us and them. And one of us won, and then the election season was over.
Right.
But now, thanks to 24-hour news cycle and 24/7 and social media, it's nonstop campaigns. Obama started this, basically. He had a campaign organization going the entire time. And in fact, he never turned it over to the party. He just changed its name. And it's a place to park his cronies. So it's a very Chicago kind of thing. But we've had these eternal campaigns, and it's us versus them. And you can't accept that somebody has a different opinion. And you talk. It's almost like I said in a column, it's almost like I talk, therefore I am. So there's no listening. There's very little listening going on, and there's no convincing going on. It's just I'm going to yell at you, my side, and I'm going to yell over you when you try to say yours. And it's sad. It's corrosive to democratic spirit, a sense of community spirit that
Right.
We're all in this together. The media has not helped. The last time we kind of had this national unity feeling, almost unanimous, was in 2011 on 9/12. And Congress singing out on the steps together, and everyone feeling that they were Americans and we were under attack. And it's unfortunate that the unity came from such a tragedy, but we need to work something else out where we're not in this 24/7 4-year partisan cycle.
I kind of think that handing abortion back to the legislatures might be a good start, actually, because I think that it will be poisonous for a while longer. But I think eventually, when people get used to the idea that you're going to have to legislate policy on this, you're going to get to some compromises on it, because the vast majority of American people are in the middle on this question. I'm not, by the way, and I'll say it right off the bat, I'm not. But I recognize that the vast majority of Americans are. And what you're going to find, even in a state like Texas, is that the popular pressure for some limited access to abortion is going to be just too much. And the state's eventually going to have something that is a first trimester limited under certain conditions for adults only, right? So without or minors with parental involvement, which is about where the vast majority of Americans are at. And people aren't going to be happy with that. But the fact that you do it through legislatures, you do it through the popular process, makes it a lot easier. And I'll tell you, my experience with this actually is in Minnesota with same-sex marriage, where we had a constitutional amendment that was going to enshrine marriage as one man, one woman. The Catholic Church was involved in this. The evangelical churches, even some of the Lutheran churches were involved in this. And it didn't pass. It was an amendment. It didn't pass. It was a referendum. I'm sorry. It didn't pass. And then the next session of the legislature turned around and they didn't put it in I don't believe they made it a constitutional amendment, but they just passed a statute saying that the state will recognize same-sex marriages. And it passed, and everybody had their say. And I can tell you that the losing side wasn't happy about it, but everybody recognized that everybody had their say, and it went through the democratic process. And that's the way it should have been. And so it became this is before Obergefell, by the way. In Minnesota, this took place before Obergefell, excuse me. And it was, again, the losing side wasn't terribly happy about it, but everybody understood that it was pretty much the fight was over at that point, and you can move on to other topics, other policies.
And you get a whole lot more say at the state level than you do at the federal level. When it's a Supreme Court, you have no say.
That's right. That's right. Now, I still think Obergefell was wrong. I don't necessarily, and look, I'm not talking about the policy. I'm talking about the Supreme Court doing what it did. And to me, it is an awful lot like Roe. And I understand what Clarence Thomas was saying in his concurrence that they should go back and revisit a whole raft of these decisions. But they're not going to do it because nobody's suing to overturn Obergefell. Nobody's even talking about that. Right after Roe, you immediately had all sorts of people trying to challenge the law in Roe and going back through the course and trying to make this fight. And it was going on for 50 years. It's been what? I want to say, has it been 8 years since Obergefell? I think it was 2014, right? And I don't think there's been a single challenge in federal court that has even bothered. Nobody, it's okay. It's not going to get there because nobody's going to take it there. Abortion's different because it involves killing a human being, and people recognize that. So yes, I think that, to your point, I think it's a great point. Once we're out of the stupid season in the wake of the Dobbs decision, and I think we're actually almost all the way out of that. The only people who are still screaming about this are the activists. It's not moving the polls. It's not having any impact on the electoral outcomes that we've seen in primary races. Just in this past week, had no effect on stuff, even though it was being covered 24/7 by the media. I think once we're out of the stupid season on this, it is the first step in drawing some of that poison back out of the body politic and making democracy work the way it's supposed to work, to create a self-governing republic.
And coincidentally, but fortuitously, the decision came at the beginning of summer when a lot of people tune out of news and they go on vacation.
Yeah, the other thing too was it was leaked. The controlling opinion on this was leaked. The only thing that changed is that Alito added material to address the dissents and some of the and especially the Roberts concurrence, the semi-concurrence from Roberts. And so it was expanded, but it's still the same. It's still the same opinion. It's still the same.
And remember, when it was leaked, it was a work in progress. It wasn't the final decision. This is what they do. They pass it around and everybody comments on it. Sometimes newspapers do that. It drove me crazy when I was working for them.
Well, because
nobody agreed. Not everybody, but a lot of people feel they have to make a criticism or a suggestion to prove that they're there. And it's not necessarily, it's like fashion and education policies. It's not that it makes it better, it's just a little different. And somebody can feel like they had an impact. It doesn't make it any better. And that's something that annoyed the hell out of me when I was the victim of it. But I'm no longer a victim.
You've never been a victim, Andrew Malcolm. You're the prince of Twitter and the regent of Red State.
That royalty gets its way.
That's right. RHIP. Rank has its privileges. Speaking of rank, the top-ranked Catholic, Pope Francis, wants everyone to know, by the way, I'm not retiring. This has been, the speculation on this has been absolutely hilarious. I've been sitting back here, saying, guys, none of this means anything. I know that you want it to mean something because it sells, but you're literally making stuff up. And this time, back up and tell us what you saw happening. So Pope Francis was going to pay a visit to the shrine of the Pope that last retired before Pope Benedict, like 600 years or so ago, as part of something else that he's doing in the area. And because Benedict did the same thing right before he announced his retirement, everybody says, well, this is the big signal. Pope Francis is going to retire, blah, 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 blah. And, okay, so who's next? What does it mean? Pope Francis is retiring. What does that mean? Or maybe retiring, right? And as it turns out, Pope Francis on Monday said, I'm not resigning. I don't know where you guys got this, but I'm really not resigning. And Reuters covered it. Andrew sent this over to me because he's always been amused by this. There was really no basis for this other than the fact that Pope Francis was temporarily in a wheelchair because of some infirmities that he has. And so Reuters actually sat down and asked him. Imagine that, yes. In an exclusive interview in his Vatican residence, Francis also denied rumors that he had cancer, joking that his doctors didn't tell me anything about it, and said that no, he's not. He is not retiring.
So what you're saying, Ed, is that people waiting outside for the smoke are going to be waiting for a while.
Yes. They're going to be waiting. They're going to be waiting a good long while, and unfortunately, that also includes the otherwise fantastic Megyn Kelly, who it's almost a satire. She was there at the Vatican with their family, and taking a tour of the Vatican, including the Sistine Chapel, right? So she's on the A tour, right? Because there are B tours. You have to be careful about who you tour with at the Vatican. And her tour guide informed her that it's very unusual to see cardinals and bishops around St. Peter's Square. Which is, either her tour guide just started working that day or was pulling their leg, right? Or Megan's pulling ours. And then there was a priest at the Sistine Chapel who blessed the people in the Sistine Chapel, and Megyn Kelly was telling people on her Instagram thing, well, I'm told that's very unusual. No.
And that proves he's resigning.
Yeah. That was sort of like, they say that's very unusual, so maybe there's something to these rumors. Having worked briefly, and I'm no means an expert at this, but I have worked a couple of times in the press office at the Vatican, and I can tell you from personal experience that it is the world's largest collection of black cassocks and magenta and red zucchettas in the entire world. If you go to nearby Piazza del Risorgimento, which is it's just right, kind of just on the outside of the Vatican, where there's some really nice little trattorias and some cheapy places to eat as well, and the place is swarming with bishops and cardinals and priests. So it's a day without a bishop at the Vatican is like a day without sunshine. I'm telling you that. It's not a sign. Not a sign. But it is part of sort of like the speculative impulse that people in the media get, and it's just kind of silly, right?
Yeah, well, it's silly, and it's like people. This is some time ago when some of my colleagues were asking about how to deal with Twitter, and I said, you think of Twitter as little sticky notes. There's nothing lasting or impactful, enduring about tweets. They're here, they're gone, poof. And so don't get all uptight about them. But now that we have them, people feel that they can offer an opinion, which is fine. It's okay, but we didn't used to have so many opinions.
Yeah.
And not all of them informed.
I'm reminded of that Mary Tyler Moore episode. And you and I have talked about this before. It's one of my favorite scenes in this, where Mary Tyler Moore is she got a tip from a stringer at a teachers union strike that the strike was over, and nobody else had that information. So Lou decides to run the story, even though it might, it's totally single sourced and nobody's sure, they can't confirm it. And he starts telling this anecdote. I remember one Sunday morning I was working as the desk guy, and I got this hot tip about a Japanese attack, and I couldn't find anybody to call, and I couldn't confirm the story. And I just made a decision that we're going to run this. And so that morning we ran the story that the Japanese had just bombed San Diego. And everybody in the room, it's a great scene. You have to watch this scene. And I love this show anyway, right? And everybody in the room is like, you can see everybody's like building up to it. And when he says San Diego, everybody goes, oh.
Oh, crap.
Oh, crap. So, yeah.
When I was new in the business, this is a long, long time ago, an old timer told me on election night one time, he said, you're going to get a lot of pressure from New York, from the desk to call an election, who's a winner, projected winner. But he said, you can always call an election, but you can never uncall.
You can never uncall it. You can also not uncall an attack on San Diego.
That's right.
You cannot uncall a Japanese bombing run on San Diego.
Editors know clarification. You know that report we had that San Diego was bombed? Never mind.
Never mind.
There was a great tweet. Where was it? It was it was on Instagram, but it was that iconic picture of Mel Gibson all painted up in Braveheart with the blue face just before the battle, and he's screaming, and the caption underneath in big letters was "Never mind."
Speaking of movies, I actually went to a movie for the first time since December 2019. And it's not that I didn't want to go to the movie theater. Frankly, I just didn't see a movie that was worth it. The only one that I do regret now passing on is Dune, which I saw when it got to, home theater, and it's fantastic. I really enjoyed Dune. But so we went and saw Top Gun Maverick this weekend, and it was fantastic. It was really good. It was worth going back to the theater for. So, now we're
that's good. And your review got a lot of traction. I retweeted it. I said, Mikey likes it.
I saw that. Thank you very much. Yeah. And I know the movie had been out for, about 5 weeks before I did the review. So it's not, a super timely review, but
okay. But reviews are like columns, they're personal. They're what's, you go to them because of the person who's writing it. Either you value their opinion or you're curious about it. There's no universal review. When I was in journalism school, which is even longer ago, we had a critical writing instructor, and he had us go to something. I happened to pick a play at the Northwestern Speech School, which is where a lot of people, Dreyfus and a whole lot of Charlton Heston, a whole bunch of actors went. So I went and I wrote a review about the play, and you turned it in and he graded them. And then the next assignment was, whatever you said about the play, turn it around. So if you liked the play, you had to write a critical, no, this is a terrible
that's
thing.
Interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting. And
good exercise.
It was a very good lesson in how you can, in how you can be so subjective that and you were forced to come out with an opposite opinion. I really look back on that. I don't remember what I said. I probably liked it because that was easy. But it was a good lesson in how you can marshal arguments either way.
Yep. And, I got to tell you, there's two pitfalls in writing reviews. Well, there's actually a number of them, but two main ones for me. One is that you fall in love with writing really nasty reviews.
Yeah.
Because it's fun to write a really critical review because you really get to break out all the tools, right? And it's easy because it's easy to criticize stuff, right? Yeah. It's easy to nitpick something to death. And the other pitfall.
And to show how much you know.
Yes, because it becomes very much a self-inflating exercise, right? I think of that in terms of, I can't think of the actor's name, the theater critic in All About Eve. right? I can't think of, he's a great actor and he did a great job in that movie. But, I mean, it was really all about himself. You know, it was all about how brilliant he was and how he could mold the theater. The theater could not exist without him. And I think it's easy to fall into that trap when you're writing reviews. But the other trap is only seeing things that you think you're going to like so that all of your reviews kind of come out sounding sort of, I don't know, promotional.
Yeah.
This is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Oh my God.
Yeah. Well, it's why the credibility is so important, and not just in reviews, but in politics and reporting. People, even though you don't know it, people look for certain bylines, and they follow those bylines, and they give you credibility or critical. And if I had a couple of favorites on the New York Times. John Noble Wilford was the space writer, and anything he wrote, I would read. That, I mean, I don't care what he's writing about, vacation or anything. I'm reading it because he always included something I didn't know about space. So the credibility is important on reviews, and that's the credibility in news coverage that the media these days has blown up.
Yep. All right. Well, on that note, we got to talk about the jokes of the week, and hopefully they're not from my review of Maverick.
Right. Mikey likes it. Well, these are all old, and I'm running low, so I hope they're not repeats. But Jimmy Fallon said a man in boxer shorts shut down an LA freeway when he climbed an exit sign, hung political banners, vaped, danced, and shouted from a bullhorn. He's already being described as the Democrats' best hope in 2024. Yeah.
Michael Avenatti. That's Michael Avenatti, I think, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Conan, obviously this is an old one. He says, NSA leaker Edward Snowden has been staying the last 2 days in Moscow's airport, not because he's hiding, but because he's flying on United.
Surprised he can find a flight.
Yeah. And Seth Meyers said, this is a replay. He said, Hillary Clinton joined Instagram this afternoon, and somehow she's already deleted thousands of photos.
That's amazing. It's amazing. She's the most efficient politician we've ever had.
Delete. And that's something that Hunter Biden should have done.
Ghislaine Maxwell got 20 years in prison. She's still not talking about Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book. It makes me wonder when Ghislaine Maxwell is going to be found, dead by suicide. I'm just joking. I think
she
Epstein
stabbed herself in the back
15 times.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually think Epstein did kill himself. I just think that they weren't particularly concerned whether he did or not. But it is interesting. She made it through the trial. She got sentenced to 20 years. We'll see if...
see how long they last.
Well, we'll see how long it takes before she starts trying to deal. Hey, let's talk about some of the guys that were involved in this. She hasn't done that yet, but they didn't come to her rescue either, so we'll see how long that lasts. All right. Andrew Malcolm, of course, is the prince of Twitter at AHMalcolm on Twitter, the regent of redstate.com. Go read his great stuff. By the way, we didn't even mention that he's got a new podcast up over there. Can You Handle a Sign of Hope this week? So go check that out as well. Malcolm on the Right, episode 16. Go find out what he has to say about the sign of hope this week. Andrew Malcolm, thanks so much for being with us today.
You bet. Thanks, Edward. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week, buddy.
Happy Independence Day.
Yeah, same to you.
All right, stay tuned. We're going to come back with more from the Ed Morrissey Show right after this. Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Joining me now from the Substack, where he is now writing, Paul Mirengoff joins us again to talk a little bit about what happened in the past week or so regarding the January 6th committee, Cassidy Hutchinson, the mistakes, where it goes from here. And Paul, first off, remind everybody where they can find your Substack that you and Bill Otis are writing right now.
It's called Ringside at the Reckoning. Probably a little bit too long for a title. I thought it was catchy at the time. Now I think I should have just said Ringside, but it's Ringside at the Reckoning at Substack.com.
There you go. And a lot of good people are at Substack these days. So Barry Weiss is at Substack. Bernie Goldberg is he's at Patreon. But I believe Barry Weiss is at Substack. It's a pretty good platform for people to go independent and to do as much work as they want to do and still get some compensation for it.
I saw that Ann Coulter just joined.
Yes, I did see that too. That's interesting. You would think that Ann Coulter would have had the resources to do something a little bit more commercial, right? Set up her own shop, but why not? I mean, Substack is there. Why not do it that way?
Absolutely. And, depending on how many people she brings, I assume she'll bring a lot. It will be a good business enterprise for her as well. Yeah,
no kidding. And she's got a great draw, so she should be able to bring quite a few people. Now, we were talking, when I'm introducing you about this, we were talking about something that you wrote regarding the January 6th committee, the Cassidy Hutchinson testimony, and how it's kind of started to fall apart, at least in part. And I mean, I'm not an attorney, but and I haven't even played one on television. And I rarely stay at a Holiday Inn Express. And even I know better than to have your star witness, who's actually got at least potentially valuable eyewitness testimony, to lead her into hearsay and speculation and innuendo on direct examination, no less, not even on cross-examination. I mean, that whole thing was strange.
It really was, because, hearsay is fine if you can back it up. And I had assumed when she testified that the people whose conversations she was testifying about and whose firsthand knowledge she was purporting to know had been interviewed by the committee, which I think they had been,
yep, and
had backed her up on this very point. Otherwise, there's no need to get into that. I mean, you get nice headlines, Trump grabbing at the wheel and grabbing at the throat of a Secret Service agent, but it wasn't necessary testimony. It doesn't really add anything to the underlying issue of his responsibility, if any, for January 6th. The important point about that whole limo incident, and I think it's undisputed, was that he was furious at not being able to lead the crowd, to be driven to the Capitol and lead the crowd. That's all they needed to get out of her, but they couldn't resist, going for the knockout punch. But they didn't have, or they may not have had, it doesn't look like they had what they needed to back it up.
Well, I'm not even sure that was, I mean, okay, so he's angry that he's not leading the crowd down there. I'm not even sure that that's terribly germane. I think the bigger issue that she testified to was that Trump knew that people in the crowd were armed before he sent them down to the Capitol. And she said that she personally heard him tell the Secret Service to take down the magnetometers, because if the people in that crowd were carrying arms, he wasn't the target. And he wasn't afraid of that. That, to me, I mean, that's still not necessarily enough legally for an incitement charge, but certainly politically. And I mean, this is really a political case that the January 6th committee is building. And there was one other point too about she had been a witness to Mark Meadows, and I think maybe one or two other members of Congress who were who were at least asking about getting pardons regarding anything that happened on January 6th. And that's certainly substantive testimony, because a request for pardons indicates some sort of guilty conscience, at least arguably can indicate some sort of guilty conscience. So those are really the big points that Cassidy Hutchinson was making. And so I don't understand, if you want to get the other stuff into the record, why you don't call Tony Ornato, or I think the other person was Engel, who was in the car, to deliver that testimony, because that would have been direct testimony. And now the Secret Service is saying that they want to testify before the committee because presumably they're unhappy about what was said, and presumably they're going to contradict that part of it.
you have to know what Ornato and Engel would say. It's kind of the equivalent of on cross-examination. You don't ask a question if you don't know the answer.
Right.
On direct examination, you don't put somebody on to testify about what other people did unless you know what they're going to say about what they did. If you don't have firsthand knowledge.
Right.
The other thing, in addition to the two things you said that are most critical, I thought was her overhearing Meadows and White House counsel Cipollone saying, Mike Pence, I don't care if they hang Mike Pence or something to that effect.
Yes. Yeah, you're right about that. Yeah.
Again, she doesn't have, unless Cipollone testifies and they're trying to get him to and agrees with her, it's all going to rest on her credibility, and her credibility might well end up being shot once the Secret Service folks end up getting their version on the record, if that's what happens, and it looks like it might.
Yeah, I mean, because part of the problem here is that while she's an eyewitness to those things, to the direct testimony that she was giving, right, rather than the hearsay that she was also passing along, there's only, at least so far as we've seen, there's only been she's the only point of corroboration, right? And that's not a problem, right? As long as you can maintain the credibility of a witness. And Cassidy Hutchinson doesn't appear to have an axe to grind. She was working for, Meadows. And so she was working within what you could call Trump world. And so doesn't have a history of public repudiation and all that kind of thing. So she wouldn't make a bad witness in that case. But the problem is that because unless they've got some other people that can testify to this, Paul, she's the only point of corroboration on this. And if her credibility is undermined, it really becomes more or less worthless, at least in terms of a court proceeding. I would say politically speaking, it's a little bit different, but in terms of the legal process, a prosecutorial process, it really just undermines the value of that witness.
Yeah, and even politically, what the committee doesn't want, and what they're really trying to do by calling all these Republicans, especially, is to move the needle with people who are undecided or who are pro-Trump to a degree. And it seemed like Hutchinson might well have accomplished that because, in the immediate aftermath of her testimony, because she did seem credible. She doesn't seem to have an axe to grind, like you just said, Ed. But if it becomes a matter of her testifying to stuff with her credibility in tatters, then sure, the Democrats the Trump haters are going to say, I think she's credible, and she might well be. I mean, it's possible that Ornato won't be telling the truth if he testifies.
Right.
But it's just going to break down on party and ideological lines again, which is what the committee was hoping to break through. Might have done a better job of breaking through if they'd allowed a few Republicans who don't hate Trump onto the committee, or if they'd allowed, in particular, Jordan and I guess it was Banks who they
Jordan
vetoed.
Banks, yeah.
And that led McCarthy to say, well, if you won't take them, we're not going to serve up anybody else. That might have helped, but I think even without that, they seemed to be on the verge of winning some undecided folks over. But that's all in jeopardy now, thanks to an unforced error.
Yeah, truly unforced error. You're getting at something here that I was arguing as well. And by the way, you should go to ringside@thereckoning.substack.com to read what Paul and Bill Otis are writing about this. But if this had been a truly adversarial process in court, right? First off, if this had been in court, that other testimony probably wouldn't have been allowed. Her direct testimony as to what she herself witnessed would have been, would be very difficult for me to see how I know that there's exceptions to hearsay, but I don't think the situation that you have here would have cleared that. I think that a judge would have said, no, if you want to get the testimony about what happened in the car, you're going to have to produce a witness a witness with direct testimony about that. Am I correct about that?
I think so.
So you mentioned not having the more Republicans, Jim Jordan or Banks, or even just some other Republicans on there who would have been naturally oriented to an adversarial position, not necessarily, corruptly so. And I'm not even suggesting that. The reason why you have an adversarial role on these committees, especially select committees that are doing investigations, is because it keeps the other side thinking about what the response is going to be when you do something. It really, it really forces a significant risk of backfire if they try to go overboard, because the other side is going to have its say. And I think that these guys just really got caught up in having full control of this and I don't think they're even considering the issues that we're talking about. Until it blew up in their face, they weren't considering it.
I think that's probably right. I mean, Liz Cheney tried to anticipate perhaps contrary testimony by Engel when she said, "Okay, you heard this conversation. You heard Ornato say this to you about what happened in the car. Did Engel ever contradict it?" But that's not good enough. And I think you're absolutely right as to the psychology of this. I was an attorney for 35 years, and I never had a case where there was no opposing counsel and where my co-counsel was presiding over the proceedings. So I can't say that in that situation I wouldn't have become a bit complacent too. But I'd like to think that your judgment wouldn't completely dissipate in those circumstances. It looked like they had been very careful up until that point. But I think you're right about the psychology of it. They just got overconfident because they didn't feel anybody was going to contradict them. What can I say? I mean, it's. I'm wondering
if you've been
in life.
I'm wondering if you ever fantasize about being able to go into court and not having any opposing counsel and just being able to.
I used to fantasize. I used to fantasize about playing tennis without a net too, but never quite worked out that way.
Well, all right. So, Paul, the other point that came up, right, and this was another point that was on direct testimony. That's all direct testimony. I'm using the wrong term here, but eyewitness testimony, I think, is a better way of putting it, rather than speculative or hearsay. Had to do with the memo that was written, and the memo was I forget what the memo was, but there was a memo that was written, and Liz Cheney asked Cassidy Hutchinson, "This was in your handwriting, right?" And she said yes. And then a White House attorney later said, "I'm the one who wrote that." Or former White House attorney, obviously
right.
Not in this administration. "I'm the one who wrote that. Furthermore, I told the committee that I was the one who wrote that. The committee knows this." I mean, that's not just going to Cassidy Hutchinson's credibility. It's also going to the credibility of the committee itself.
Yeah. And by the way, that attorney, Hirschfeld or
Hirschfeld. Yeah, I think it's Hirschfeld or Hirschenfeld or something like that. Yeah.
Pretty hostile to Trump in the clips that they play. He's the one who said, "I told Eastman, you better get yourself a good criminal lawyer." I mean, he has not been a pro-Trump witness. And I think I think that makes him all the more credible. They can, with Ornato, they can say, "Well, he's a Trump guy. Trump promoted him from the Secret Service to deputy chief of staff." This guy doesn't have that. That is again an unforced error. I think standing by itself, that's the kind of thing that you would just chalk it off as a mistake. But on Hutchinson's part, on the committee's part, it's pretty inexcusable. But coupled with the other credibility issues, it's like a double whammy.
Yeah, and again, unforced errors. It's of a piece, I think, of how that testimony came about, because this was not a day. This was on Thursday, I believe. Yesterday was Thursday. It was on Tuesday, and it wasn't on the schedule. It was like within 16, 17 hours. This had suddenly appeared on the schedule. They were rushing to let everybody know that they were going to do this. It was like they had some sort of breaking news. And apparently part of this was because Cassidy Hutchinson had got herself new attorneys and decided that she wanted to share a little bit more about what she knew than what her previous attorneys wanted her to do. But I mean, this was a rush job in the first place. And I can understand why you do that if you had like a real smoking gun. But I don't think this was a real smoking. It was certainly significant. The parts where she was an eyewitness were significant. But A, I don't think it was a smoking gun. It probably should have been prepared better. And B, I think that whole rush, the sort of, urgent thing is another way in which this sort of the committee's really starting to build itself some serious credibility issues, even with people who might be inclined to be sympathetic to what they were doing.
I think so. Yeah, the old adage, "Too good to check," comes to mind. They just thought, this is awesome. I don't know if it was awesome, but it was good stuff, in my opinion. Maybe not a smoking gun, but something that really would have advanced the ball for them. And they just said, well, let's get it out there, and an unforced error due to, being overjoyed and falling in love with this particular testimony.
Yeah. And I think, again, if you had an adversarial process in place, it would have probably given them some pause about doing that, and at least slowed it down to where they could make sure that they had their ducks in a row.
I think so.
Yeah. So, Paul, where do you think this is going? I hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, this is they're building a case for the Department of Justice to charge Donald Trump," and I'm looking at this and saying this isn't really a legal case. I don't think they're really building a legal case, and I think if they were trying to, they'd actually be actively interfering with whatever the Department of Justice is doing right now, because they're putting all the potential witnesses on television, which is something that traditionally the Department of Justice is very unhappy when Congress does that in an investigation that they're doing. My guess is that they're really just trying to build a political case, not for this year, but for 2024, trying to make Trump so toxic that Republicans will just decide he's not worth the effort.
I agree with you, Ed, and that raises a question I'd love to hear your take on. I don't think I've seen it, although you may have. Arguably, the Democrats the committee is helping the Republicans purge themselves of Donald Trump. Does the committee want to do that? Are they taking into account who they want to run against, who they want their Democrat to run against in 2024? Or are they saying, we don't care. We just, we just need to get this guy out of politics. Damn the consequences. I'm having trouble thinking why they are so intent on. I understand why Liz Cheney is, of course, and her partner from Illinois, but I don't understand why the Democrats on the committee want to take down Trump so badly. I wonder what you think about that.
I really honestly think it's because they think he's going to try to run again in 2024 and they want to kneecap him, which is fine. I don't think that that's really a legitimate use of House committees, but it's certainly not unprecedented. Maybe it's unprecedented in terms of actual presidential electoral politics, but this type of stuff is done by committees quite a bit, where they go out. Yeah, let's not kid ourselves. Most of these select committees, you can go back to Benghazi, for instance, which was clearly trying to lay blame both on Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, and everybody knew Hillary Clinton was going to run for the nomination, likely get it in 2016.
Do you think the Democrats want to run? Would rather run against Trump? Would rather run against DeSantis than Trump? Because
no.
By kneecapping Trump, if they're successful, which, as we've just been discussing, they may well not be. But if they're successful, that would assist DeSantis and would imply that they would rather run against DeSantis than Trump. And I don't think that's what they want.
I don't think that that's really what they're aiming for. I think they're going on the assumption that Trump is just going to win the nomination. But I think there's a number of problems with making that assumption, and I'll run them down, and you and I can discuss them a little bit. First off, Trump's going to be 78 in 2024. We've just had a 78-year-old elected to this office. It didn't work out well. Number two, Trump's entire orientation now is all about 2020. It's all a grievance. It's all about him. Voters really aren't going to care about that in 2024. They're going to want to know what they're going to do for the next 4 years, next 8 years, next 12 years. And then at the present, they want a president. They're going to look for a nominee and then in the general election, a president who's focused on their problems right now, not his problems 4 years ago. And here's the third reason. And I think this one is maybe even going to be more resonant within the GOP / conservative donor community, they're going to want somebody who can run for a second term. And Donald Trump can't run for a second term. They're going to elect the 78-year-old guy and live with all the chaos that comes with it. At the end of all that, they're still going to have to come up with a new guy to run in 4 years. I mean, it's almost like electing a lame duck right from day one. And certainly after the midterms. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of political strategic sense. And so I think I think you're right. Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, they want Trump gone, and they would like to see all the people affiliated with Trump marginalized too. So that's their motivations. But I actually think that Republicans, I think a lot of Republicans are going to look at this and say, we think Trump really got screwed, and this House committee isn't credible, and we think that this is all just a put up job. But on the other hand, we need somebody who can do 2 terms, somebody who wasn't born, before rock and roll was invented, and somebody who we can rely on to stay awake at nights. So yeah, maybe Ron DeSantis is the better bet, or Glenn Youngkin, who's 55 years old, or somebody like that. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, because I actually honestly think that after these midterms are over, there's going to be a much more robust reassessment of where this party stands vis-a-vis Trump.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think if the committee can maintain or regain its credibility, it will help that process along. Speaking as someone who was born before rock and roll was invented, I don't hold that against Trump, But yeah, I mean, I think there will be there is already starting to be a reassessment, but I still think that it's maybe 50-50 or better that Trump will be the nominee, unless the committee can help move the needle. And I'm still not sure why they're trying to do it. I guess it's just kind of hatred of Trump derangement, and maybe a sense that he will be the nominee. And a lack of confidence in the factors that you cite. But I think they're all good reasons for a reassessment, and I think there will be a reassessment.
Actually, and I'll say this, I think that the committee's actually, in that sense, if that's their idea, it's actually going to backfire. They're still making politics all about Trump. The best thing to do with this would have been just to let the Department of Justice do whatever it was going to do, leave it alone, let him stew on the sidelines, while Ron DeSantis, Glenn Youngkin, other Republicans rise up. I actually think that if there's a reassessment process, this committee is actively going to retard it. And it's going to make it tougher, because it's going to force a lot of Trump's base to dig their heels in and just demand that, as a matter of justice, he gets a chance to he gets another chance at the office. But I don't think that will last long. I don't think that will last long either, though.
Yeah. I think if the committee was doing a better job, the Trump people would dig their heels in, but they're going to support him anyway. But a lot of people are just going to say, well, I don't know, I can't sort all this out, but we just need to get past this. We can't be relitigating this. And if we nominate Trump, we will be relitigating this. Yeah. I'll give you one more bit of hearsay, completely unreliable, I think. I know a guy. Whenever you hear that, I know a guy who lives down there in Trump land, and who says he's met with Trump, and he says that he heard Trump when Trump learned that that these hearings were to be carried by all 3 networks. His response was, "I'll be on all 3 networks. It's going to be about me on all 3 networks." I don't vouch for that, but I don't discount it either. And that goes to what you're saying. He wants it to be all about him, and the committee is making it all about him.
I think so. And I think, I think back to what happened in 2015 when, they were carrying all the networks were carrying his rallies live as supposedly as sort of a warning. And all they did was just, again, make center politics on Donald Trump. And the Democrats did the same thing. Everything they talked about was Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And I think that if we'd had 2 years of just, everybody ignoring Donald Trump, then you'd be farther along that path where Republicans are going to start looking at it rationally. But I think no matter what, after the midterms are over, that's when that's going to happen. They're going to look at 2024 and say, do we really want to go back for a guy who's only good for one term, who's 78 years old, who has all this chaos and baggage, and is completely focused on the rearview mirror? Or do we want somebody who is fresh, who can still speak to that same base, who can potentially run for 2 terms and is young enough to underscore just how old Democrats have gotten? That, I think, is the question.
And if it's a case, and in DeSantis's case, maybe someone who's just won a big victory in what used to be a completely 50-50 state and is still, not a gimme for Republicans.
Yeah, although I think it's trending into gimme status these days. And so, yeah, I think that I actually think that even if the committee is slowing that process down with this, I think that the reassessment is going to happen anyway. So, yeah, we should talk about that after the midterms, though. I mean, we'll talk between now and the midterms too, but we should talk about that definitely after the midterms, because I think that's when everybody's going to say, okay, look, okay, we really do need to find some fresh blood here, and we need to shake this out. We need to get past this. Let's find somebody who can do 8 years looking forward, and that somebody can't be somebody who is already got one term under their belt. So, one other thought too, before I let you go, because you're a smart guy. In the 19th century, we ran through a bunch of real mediocrities, right? Both before Abraham Lincoln, especially before Abraham Lincoln.
Before they were worse than mediocrities.
Yeah, they were flat out terrible. And then after Lincoln, in the late 19th century, ran through a series of mediocrities too. I'm not necessarily certain that we're not going to start running through one-term presidencies here. I think that unless there's a major realignment, I think that we've got such a evenly divided electorate that I see flip-flopping for the next maybe 20, 30 years in our future here. And I'm not necessarily sure we're going to have a whole lot of two-term presidents for the foreseeable future.
I think it comes down to whether the country can right itself, stay sound economically, avoid catastrophes like wars that go bad or pandemics, which are not really anybody's fault, but still, right now I think the mood is pessimistic, especially on the economy. If we can somehow, get back on a strong footing, and after the Civil War, it was one party domination, in part because of the Civil War. The Democrats had been on the wrong side of it, and in part because there were certainly ups and downs, but the country was growing like crazy. People were flocking here, and the economy was booming along with the Industrial Revolution. If we can get to that mode, then I think we'll see, 2-term presidencies and maybe even 3 or 4 term presidencies within a party. But if things go the way they are now, where there's a crisis every couple of years and the economy is unstable, then it's going to be bounced back and forth. And we probably didn't see our first turmoil in a transition either, if that's the case.
Yep. All right, Paul Mirengoff, you can find him at ringsideatthereckoning.substack.com. Paul, you're not on Twitter, are you?
I'm not.
Good for you. I told you guys, Paul's a smart guy. That's why I like talking with Paul. I am on Twitter. You can make any value judgments on that you will. But in order to read Paul, you definitely have to go to ringsideatthereckoning.substack.com. Paul, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
When we come back, more from the Ed Morrissey Show, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast edition. Joining me right now is my friend Phil Kerpen from AmericanCommitment.org. AmericanCommitment.org. He's also a columnist at Kagel.com. So you can read his work in either of those two places. And we often talk about economic issues, and Phil's got a good piece up today. Reject new energy taxes with energy prices already soaring. Now, this is actually not up today, but this is something that you've been working on for quite a while. And Phil, why is this important to get this word out now? Are we looking at more taxes on the energy sector?
Well, it's actually kind of a remarkable situation because obviously the number one issue on pretty much everyone's mind is the outrageous run-up in the prices for energy. And I think gasoline's up over 50% in the past year, and energy overall is up 35%. So it's really hammering people hard, and it's not just inflation, because inflation's running 8%. It's much, it's a real price increase above and beyond all the money creation. It's being driven by a lot of things that we can get into. But the one thing that I think most people would assume is, quote unquote, big oil is out there trying to lower prices and advocating for my interests and using their lobbying might and their clout. And you kind of just assume that that's happening. But remarkably, they're kind of doing the opposite in that, the Wall Street Journal somehow got a hold of this slide deck that the lobbyists for the big oil companies have been shopping around town in Washington. And they're actually saying, please pass a carbon tax, please pass a tax on oil and gas that we will collect and from our customers and remit to you. And they're even saying things like, but keep this secret because we don't want to anger the Republicans, before they might come back into power and that kind of thing. And I think it's really important for people to know about this, not because it's going to happen anytime, in the immediate term, but the fact that it's still being kept alive and the fact that industry players are pushing for it means it's the kind of thing that some dumb Republicans might do even after they have control and might do in a big bipartisan agreement or something like that. And I just think it's really critical that we as taxpayers, as consumers, are actively advocating on these energy issues and not making the false assumption that the industry is doing that.
Well, and a part of this too is it's driven on the I don't want to say the assumption, but on the predicate that oil companies are making windfall profits, that they're making money hand over fist here. I mean, there's a lot of nonsense information that's going out there, and certainly revenues are up for oil companies. That's a function of inflation. In some cases, profits are up somewhat, but for the most part, if you take a look at the quarterly reports for the major oil companies, that includes the refiners, and I've done this, right? I've looked at the Q1 numbers when, prices were soaring. This is supposedly the Putin price hike, period of time. The quarterly reports were showing basically the same level of profits that the same companies were making the year before in the same quarter, right? I think Chevron was up to 11.5%, which if you know anything about investments and publicly traded companies, 11.5% is not a bad net profit number, but it's far below things like, the finance industry, where you're more typically going to find somewhere around 20 to 21% net profits. ExxonMobil was at 6%. They'd been at 4.6% the same quarter the year before, that sort of thing. So I think there's sort of a misconception just to start off with that these guys are really raking it in, and therefore we have to do this to put a brake on, as sort of a disincentive to seek so-called, excessive or windfall profits.
Well, first of all, the Democrats are addicted to this insane idea that you make something less expensive by placing a tax on it.
Yeah.
You will have precisely the opposite effect. Chevron, by the way, I don't know if you saw this last week, they're closing their iconic Northern California corporate headquarters, and they offered all the employees there to relocate to Texas. Chevron, formerly known as the Standard Oil Company of California, has given up on California. It's kind of interesting after 140 years as kind of an iconic California company. And I think that's kind of indicative of the fact that the problems that the energy industry faces are, created by bad public policies. And nowhere in the United States has worse public policies than in the state of California. And so you can escape state policies to a certain extent, but you really can't escape the national policies. And, we're hoping that we're going to get some good news from the Supreme Court. Wednesday is going to be West Virginia versus the EPA, most likely, and they may substantially trim the asserted authority of the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. And of course, this was an absurd endeavor from the start. And it was a 5-4 Supreme Court majority in Massachusetts versus EPA that started this whole thing when they said, yeah, the states are right. EPA, you must regulate greenhouse gases under the 1970 Clean Air Act, even though in 1970, the consensus was global cooling and an ice age was coming, but somehow it's supposed to be a global warming law, even though none of its authorities are really appropriate for that purpose. And so we may get relief to a certain extent from the Supreme Court, but it's not just EPA, it's the Interior Department, which has been, shockingly aggressive on limiting leases and permits. But really, I think what's been new, and the reason there's been so much of a thumb on the scale against domestic energy production, is they've really weaponized the financial system against fossil fuels. And this is only partially through government, with things like the SEC climate disclosure rule and the Treasury Department's had summits and that kind of thing. But a lot of it is driven by the investor community, Larry Fink at BlackRock and others running university endowments and union pension funds and the whole ESG and DEI movement. They've essentially made it so that, if you invest in an oil and gas project, the hammer comes down on you and you get protested and you get divestment. And, there's so many headaches that, what we've been hearing from a lot of the companies that normally would respond to this price action by putting more wells into production, they said there's no capital. There's no money out there to do that because, nobody wants to stick their head up and get it chopped off on Wall Street. So now we've got all of the environmental regulations of the Obama years, although we're hoping for some relief from the Supreme Court. But layered on top of that, you've got this weaponization of the financial system. And if you look at what's happened, the Biden administration likes to say, well, we have record high production, which is not actually true. What they're doing is they do this chart where they do average annual production for the Trump years. So they average in the COVID year when it collapsed. And that's how they show that it's a little bit lower than where we are right now. So a little bit is just deceptive in the way they measure it. But, let's say, forget about that. Let's say it were true that we were at, a record high production. You would expect it to be much higher even than it is now because of where the price is. The way a market normally works, prices go up to $5 a gallon for gasoline, all the stuff, that is an incentive to bring a lot more wells into production. The rig count should go through the roof. The barrels of production should go through the roof. And in fact, that's happened in the rest of the world. It's happened significantly in the non-OPEC countries like Norway and Russia. Even in the OPEC countries where there's more political control, we've seen production increase significantly more than in the United States. And, we think Casey Mulligan, an economist at the University of Chicago, is going to be publishing a paper on this in the next couple of weeks that I got a sneak peek at. He ran the calculations, and based on where the price is, U.S. production in the absence of anti-energy policies would be 3 million barrels a day higher. So we have really massively blocked, prevented the run-up in production that you should see based on the price movement. And we've done it through insane, stupid policies from this administration. They have caused us to be suffering the pain that we're suffering right now, to the extent that it is. It's not to say that there wouldn't have been a price shock anyway, because, you're going to have a price shock for a whole number of reasons, regardless of what the policies were. But normally the market responds to the price shock. You get more production, the price comes back down. That's happening in other countries. That has not happened in the U.S. And we have most of the global swing capacity at this point. And so that hasn't happened is actually a huge global problem. And, this administration's been enormously dishonest about this because they said about 1 million times on the campaign trail that they wanted this to happen, that they were even willing to accept economic pain for it to happen. And even now, I remember at the first time Pete Buttigieg had his, famous Marie Antoinette line. Everyone knows the story. Supposedly, Marie Antoinette was told the people can't afford bread, and she said, "Oh, let them eat cake." Well, this administration, they say, "Oh, the people can't afford gasoline," and they say, "Oh, let them drive electric cars." And the first time Pete Buttigieg said it, I thought it was a gaffe. But then, they all said it 20 more times. That's officially the policy.
Jennifer Granholm said it, for instance.
Yeah,
yes. Yeah. And of course, Joe Biden said it's all part of his incredible transition.
Yeah, it's incredible transition. So, they're kind of trying to say, hey, why won't you invest billions of dollars into production and refining capacity, even though we're totally committed to destroying your industry in the medium term? Well,
and John Berman,
why this doesn't work.
Yeah, John Berman actually challenged, I think it was Granholm, on that very point. It was either Granholm or one of the White House advisors. And John Berman was like, well, wait a minute. How does that work? You're telling them you're going to shut this down, but you want them to invest billions of dollars that you can't possibly recoup in the period of time you're allowing them to continue operating this. And they were like, well, they can do it. They've got billions of dollars. Well, yeah, they got billions of dollars that belong to stockholders, right? And people, I mean, there's all sorts of misconceptions that go on here, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds because I want to talk about your column a little bit first. But people have this misconception, Phil, that the oil industry is 3 or 4 different corporations. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of companies that are part of this. And most of them don't have any sort of real access to capital, in large part because, again, the White House has made it clear that they don't see they want this thing shut down by 2030. So nobody's going to invest heavy capital into things like production. They're also not going to invest it in things like refining. And this is really the big bottleneck. You talk about we should be producing 3 million barrels a day more than we're producing right now if we had a rational policy. The problem is I don't think we could be refining that much. We'd basically be stockpiling it here because we're at just about max refiner capacity, and we haven't built a new refinery since 1977 here.
I think that there finally was one. I think there's one, somewhere in the Gulf that was opened a few.
No. 1977 was the last one. That was in Beaumont, Texas. Yep. They're expanding a couple, but they've also shut down a couple this year, in fact. But the expansion is one thing, but you really need robust new refining capacity, and the refining capacity keeps shrinking.
You can't make the economic. First of all, for a lot of reasons of economy of scale, it's made more economic sense to do expansions on existing footprints than to open new refineries. But what we've seen the last few years, so part of that, for some of the years, like through the 80s and stuff like that, I think it was less bad policy and more just the economic logic of expansions versus, putting. So we need to be a little careful that we talk about that long period of time. But it's been something very different for the last 10 years or so, and especially for the last couple of years, which is just the capital environment makes it an incredibly difficult sell, essentially impossible,
right,
to raise the money to build a refinery. The break evens don't work because you look at the cost, and you want to be able to depreciate something like that over 40 years. But how do you do that if all of the public policy says, we're going to be 100% EVs, or, we're supposed to be, the Trump administration, the Biden administration says we're going to be 17% EVs by model year 2026 on new vehicle sales. That's like 3 years from now. And of course they want to scale it up from there. And so you sort of, you're forced, I think, to look from an investor standpoint, you're forced to look at it as sort of like, this should, all else being equal, with the market, it is showing in the price signals, it should make sense to do this investment, but you've got to trust politicians not to destroy the value of your investment, which nobody is willing to do. And then on top of that, you've got massive permitting issues, siting issues, environmental impact statements, all of the various bureaucratic nonsense that goes with building anything of any size and scale in this country. And then because you're using toxic chemicals and they're finding and everything, like you've got all of these other EPA issues and other local and state regulatory and permitting issues. And so you've got a massive kind of wedge of all of these kind of overhead costs that are built into it. And if you can't make the investment pay off, then, even if you have access to capital from your own funds, like, if you're, an incumbent, you just can't make the economics work. And of course, this was made much, much worse in the last couple of years because you did have those closures. I think a big one closed in Pennsylvania. And, if you have closures, and, there are a number of reasons, there are market reasons and regulatory reasons, and the collapse in demand during the pandemic. And, I get why you might get, but once the closures happen, now you've got that big wedge. And so, you can have the closures make sense, but that doesn't mean that once the conditions change back to what they were before, you're going to get a reopening or a new refinery built. And so there are a lot of challenges to fixing that problem. And, the fact that the administration keeps it, every time the administration says they want more refining capacity, before they even finish the sentence, they say, oh, but we want to get off of gasoline, in the next couple of decades or whatever it is. And so, the mixed message really makes it impossible to put billions of dollars into, even a major expansion, let alone a new plant.
So why is the it says that the nation's biggest oil industry trade group is somebody I was just speaking to yesterday, right? American Petroleum Institute. is this really an API thing, or is it just their climate change committee that came up
Well,
with this?
it's interesting. They're starting to sound a lot more like me and you in terms of their pushback against the administration, because I think they're getting fed up with being a piñata. So, they are saying some of the things we've been saying, and they're kind of getting stronger in their public voice. I think it's really interesting that while their public voice is starting to be more aggressive towards the administration, at least as of a couple of months ago, they were still privately shopping this idea of a carbon tax. And I think that there's I think there are two things going on in these companies, and these are the major integrateds. These are not the small guys. The American Petroleum Institutes like BP and Shell and Exxon, sort of the big ones. And I think there are two things going on. One is I think that they've sort of internally become kind of woke, and they've bought into global warming, and they've got, I'm sure, lots of Gen Z working there now, and so they're sort of dealing with the hard left turn of all the rest of corporate America. And so they just internally, they've got to be for doing a big thing on global warming. And, this is the least bad thing. And so they're for it. And so I think that's kind of a big part of it. But I also think they still they are still holding on to this delusion, which I don't know, started 10 or 20 years ago, that if you just put on a carbon tax, then, the green groups and the Democrats will call off the dogs from the EPA and Interior, and all their other regulatory headaches and problems will go away, and they'll just have to, pay their toll, and they'll be able to conduct business essentially. And I've always thought this was a total fantasy, because I've never heard a green group or a Democrat say that they're willing to take that deal. They say, oh yeah, sure, we'll put a tax on, but they also want all the other stuff as well. And so I think that there's this naivety that you can sort of, tax your customers and, pay the toll, if you will, and that'll kind of buy you an indulgence from all the other stuff. But I just can't imagine it would actually work that way.
I think Rudyard Kipling said this best, right? In his poem about the Dana Guild.
Yeah, right.
You can pay the Dana Guild, but you'll never get rid of the Dane, right? And that's kind of, maybe they're starting to figure this out. But I was talking with Mike Summers at API, who's a great guy, and we had a great conversation on a previous podcast. And he was pretty adamant about the idea that they need less taxes and less regulation. So I'm a little surprised.
I'm hoping
that this came out of their climate change committee. I'm hoping that it gets stuffed by their executive committee.
It would be nice. It would be nice if they totally disavowed it and said, we're going to shelve this or something like that. But it's not just the oil and gas majors themselves. There was also around the same time, the Business Roundtable put out their energy plan. And this is like the corporate CEOs across sectors, like all the big companies in the economy, their CEOs are in Business Roundtable.
That one I can see more why that they would maybe, I think it's still a stupid idea. It was like a 12-point
plan or something. And number 5 was like price carbon with an asterisk. And then you go down to the asterisk and it was like, we don't care how you do it, carbon tax, cap and trade, whatever, but price it for certainty or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it was sort of like the typical warmed over corporate global warming kind of thing. And you're sort of like, what is this doing in the middle of your plan to like increase production and do all these other sensible things? And, I think part of that is just, the way committees work and, corporate America, they thought they needed to have that in there. But, I think that we need to have a lot more clarity on where we want to go directionally on energy. I don't think it works to say two totally opposing directions at the same time, the way this administration keeps saying over and over and over again. I think that we've got to put this to a choice. Do we want to let the market determine this? And if that means, another 50 or 100 years of fossil fuels, so be it. Or do we want to say we're going to put a massive thumb on the scale and spend a huge amount of money and cause a huge amount of economic pain to cause a transition that doesn't make sense on the economic merits because of, for whatever environmental reason or what have you. And, if the proposition is the latter, you got to own up to it and you have to be willing to accept those costs, which I don't think anyone actually is politically, which is why we have the muddle that we have right now. But, kind of to the point that I was making, I know I'm jumping all around a little bit, but, corporate America and corporate lobbyists are not going to make this case for us, or at least not make it clearly. And so I think it's really incumbent on us kind of as citizens to make sure kind of going into the election season that, we're sort of grilling all the candidates to be crystal clear on this, that they're not going to look for some halfway compromise or confused position, that they're going to say, we're going to let markets determine what happens on energy, and we're going to get a clear green light for American energy production so we can get things kind of turned around. And, candidates who aren't willing to do that or who have sort of wishy-washy positions, I don't think they're deserving of our support this year.
Well, Phil Kerpen, AmericanCommitment.org. I think that's a good place to leave it. But where can people find out more? I mean, AmericanCommitment.org. What can people do at AmericanCommitment.org to help get the word out?
Well, we have an action center. We're actually in the middle of changing vendors, so I'm not sure if it's totally working right now because the vendor we've used for 10 years suddenly decided to go out of business. So we're switching vendors on our Contact Congress sort of facility on the website. But usually what we do is we really push a lot of letters into regulatory agency dockets and into Congress and try to make it easy for people to make their voices heard, on kind of the key economic issues. And, all the stuff's on our website. And I'm also a Twitter addict. So if people want my up to the second thoughts, or if they can stand my up to the second thoughts, it's my last name, Kerpen.
At Kerpen. That's at Kerpen. I follow him. You should be following him at this point too. Phil Kerpen, thanks so much for being with us. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Have a good one.
Stand by for more from the Ed Morrissey Show coming up next. Thanks for tuning in to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast edition. If you liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe at each of the different platforms. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Rumble, we're on YouTube, and we're at the Town Hall Media Player. So be sure to subscribe. Subscriptions are important. Really do appreciate that. It's free. Be sure to like the video if you like that as well. We want to get the word out as much as we possibly can. Really want to thank you for being with us. And while you're at it, if you're at any one of the Town Hall websites, especially hotair.com, be sure to subscribe to our VIP program or our VIP Gold program, which has extra benefits for our subscribers. That is a paid subscription service, but that money goes to fund important initiatives such as Julio Rosas's on-the-road journalism, first-person journalism, journalism you can trust from the border, from the unrest in cities, and all other sorts of things. We do all sorts of fun things with our VIP Gold subscription members, including our VIP Gold chat that I do with Cam Edwards on Wednesday afternoons. Cam Edwards from BearingArms.com. Each of our sites have their own live chat editions and their own streaming shows for VIP Gold members. So be sure to subscribe to the Hot Air VIP Gold, which goes across the entire Town Hall media spectrum, and especially to the Ed Morrissey Show podcasts. We really appreciate it. Thank you for watching.